Bonjour tout le monde. After several weeks of moderate hype, Skyward Sword HD is finally here, and as promised, here I am to talk about it for my weekly podcast. I've been making my way through the game these last 2 days, helped along considerably by my Skyward Sword 100% guide, available now on my Patreon, shameless plug, and I wanted to share with everyone my thoughts on how the experience has compared to my time with the original Wii version. At the time I'm recording this, I've just opened up the Ancient Cistern, so I can confidently say I've gotten to a point where I've been able to try out most of the game's mechanics using the new button controls. And I have to say, all in all, it's a massive improvement over the Wii motion controls. So many frustrating segments in the original version are now much more doable, all without sacrificing the directional inputs for sword combat that's pretty much been Skyward Sword's main selling point from the beginning. Flying is more straightforward, walking on tightropes and underwater swimming are both much less of a hassle, the boss key gyro puzzles are actually fun now, and the heart minigame is significantly more responsive and even enjoyable when using the analog stick. Assuming you enjoy the humor of Fi's Uncanny Valley approximation of singing, that is. Speaking of Fi, as brought up by every other reviewer, she's a good deal less intrusive, although I did notice that when my shield was at low durability, she'd chime in about it whenever I loaded my save. They couldn't completely remove her annoyingly unnecessary messages, I guess. I mean, she is basically an AI. Similarly, not all of the button mapping is what I'd call top-notch. Some of this is a consequence of the directional inputs required for a game built around motion controls, like, for example, throwing and rolling bombs, which will definitely take some getting used to. Other stuff, though, is just baffling. Like, why does it require 3 quick pushes of the analog stick to execute a fatal blow, when the equivalent move in Twilight Princess is a basic A-button prompt? Ditto anything involving pushing in one of the analog sticks as if they were buttons, something that appears in several Switch games I've played and that has never felt natural to me. That includes rolling, spinning underwater, and most obnoxiously blocking with the shield. All of those could have easily been mapped to regular buttons, and I'm confused at the needless complication. Now, for the sake of this review, I did try out the motion control options as well for about the length of half a dungeon. From what I can tell, they're almost identical to the controls in the Wii version, albeit with fewer calibration issues. I couldn't bring myself to stick with them long, though. It was like enabling a hard mode with no reward, and this game already has a built-in hard mode. Not to mention, I do not recommend changing control schemes when you're in the middle of playing. It can be very disorienting. The best way I can describe the button controls is that they bring Skyward Sword much closer to the older 3D Zeldas and how they feel to play, but the direction-based sword combat, along with a handful of less intuitive button mapping choices, stick it in this awkward middle ground between the older games and the headache that very often was the Wii version's motion controls. Don't get me wrong, I certainly appreciate the addition of button controls, and it can't be anything but a positive that players have a choice between them and the motion controls now, but I'm not sure whether to say the developers are being too ambitious with their button mapping, or not ambitious enough in not allowing the controls to stray further from the complexity of the original, and closer toward the simpler and more intuitive controls of the game's predecessors. Of course, when it comes to discussing ambition, or lack thereof, with Skyward Sword HD, what people are more likely to focus on is pretty much everything that's not the quality of life updates, because there's very little else to say about this remaster. Apart from the minor graphical update and the small but appreciated new features like faster load times, autosaving, and less annoying item text, it really does come down to talking about the controls. I'm close to the game's halfway point at the moment, and thus far I haven't observed any content changes. On the one hand, that makes it a cinch for me to use my 100% guide to breeze through the story and side content, but on the other, I'm fairly sure that this makes Skyward Sword HD the least altered 3D Zelda remake or remaster ever. Only Ocarina of Time for the 3DS has a chance of coming close, I'd say, and even then that game added a low-effort boss rush mode and tweaked Master Quest to make it even harder. Thus far, everything I've come across has played out exactly as it does in the original, only much smoother thanks to the addition of button controls. The first in-prison fight is the same, and I have no reason to believe there won't be 2 more. The first Silent Realm felt identical to the Wii version, and you have to clear Skyview Temple a second time as expected, so I'm likewise not anticipating the removal or reduction of any of the segments later in the game that often get called out as padding. Most of the minigames benefit from the button controls, at least, turning them into less of an overall low point, even if I regret to report that Fun Fun Island still does not deserve its name. All things considered, this is still very much Skyward Sword, only with optional motion controls, and justification for this HD port really does seem to hinge entirely on those controls, alongside the potential to expose the game to a wider audience since it was released fairly late in the Wii's lifespan and used an expansion for the Wiimote that not everyone used. It's very much a matter of personal opinion whether that's enough to warrant the price tag here, but as we're talking about a first-party Nintendo game, it's not like we could have ever expected anything different. If you've been keeping up with what I've been saying about this game, you should know that I consider Skyward Sword to be a generally good game as is, and that it didn't need any major content overhauls to work as a prime example of linear, puzzle-focused 3D Zelda. I've really been enjoying myself purely from an accessibility standpoint, and I look forward to fan-favorite and personal favorite dungeon, the Ancient Cistern, with the improved swimming controls. More broadly, I'm happy to see this release starting conversations in the fandom about the quality of Skyward Sword, and whether it deserves the bad reputation it's had for all of these years. Even if that's mostly just the fandom Zelda cycle at work, where we praise the newest title by bashing the one that came before it, which in this case means Breath of the Wild. I admit I've contributed to that myself a little bit, even though I reiterate that I do think that which of the two games you prefer is more a matter of personal preference, and also that I don't hate Breath of the Wild, and could theoretically even come back to it one day in my own weird, spreadsheet-loving way. There are very few games I outright hate, and I'm just happy that people seem to be slowly coming around to the knowledge that a Zelda game doesn't need a vast open world to be good. But I've already said my piece on that subject. I'd be interested to hear what other people who played Skyward Sword HD think of the game, how they're liking the new control options, and whether it's what they were expecting from the experience. I'd like to thank everyone for listening today, and thanks especially to my subscribers and patrons. Leave a like on the video and subscribe if you enjoy my content and want to see more. Worth noting, though, there will not be a new podcast next weekend. This is because I'm working on my second video project, which I hope to have ready during the last week of July. You can follow the link in the description to my Patreon to find a little public teaser for the subject of that video, and if any of my game guides over there spark your interest, I of course greatly appreciate your support and would love for you to check those out. Au revoir!